Hello everyone, I'm Nayaswami Asha. We're working with the essence of the Bhagavad Gita as explained by Paramhansa Yogananda, remembered and recorded by his disciple Swami Kriyananda. We have been going through the chapters of the book. We've gone through 11 chapters of the book. That's not chapters of the Gita. And now we are at chapter 2 of the Gita, stanza number 40. And from this point on in the book, we are going stanza by stanza. Prior to this, Swami Kriyananda went through the first chapter of the Gita, talking about it in a general way, as those of you who've been following this course. But now the format and the way we work with it is different. Number 240 of the Bhagavad Gita reads as follows. In this path of yoga action, there is no danger of unfinished business, nor are there latent within it the opposite canceling effects of duality. Even a little practice of this religion will free one from dire fears and colossal sufferings, which are inherent in the unceasing cycles of death and rebirth. Now, through the earlier portions of the Gita, Krishna has been explaining about the illusion of death and many other aspects of the spiritual path. And now we're really beginning the practice of yoga, which is what do we do about all those conditions. This particular verse in the Bhagavad Gita is really one of the most thrilling of all possible ones, and also implies many things about the spiritual path that are extremely important to fix in our minds right from the beginning of our spiritual life. It's part of what helps us persevere. The beginning of the Gita is about the fact that the devotee Arjuna, even though he's dedicated to the spiritual path and has the spiritual advancement to be in this intimate relationship with the Lord in the form of Krishna, nonetheless, despite all his training and all his courage and all his moral commitment to the spiritual path, still his determination wavers. And that's what we've been talking about all these weeks at the beginning part of the Gita. He drives his chariot between the two opposing forces, the force of materialism and the force of spiritual aspiration and spiritual achievement. And when he sees what he's up against, he loses heart. So now Krishna is trying to explain to Arjuna, and of course, by explaining to Arjuna, explaining to all of us, why there's never any reason to lose heart on the spiritual path, no matter what it feels like or what kind of experience we think we're having at that time. And it's in this particular phrase, even a little practice of this teaching will have a profound effect on us. We tend to think in very linear terms, and we don't understand how different the spiritual path is from everyday life, because material things either are or they aren't. I mean, you either own the house or you don't own the house. You're either married or you're not married, and you either have the job or you don't have the job. And it's so fixed and absolute. What Krishna is trying to explain to us is that the spiritual path is a wholly different experience. Even a little practice of this religion, he said, has an enormous effect on our life experience. So what Swamiji then now goes on to explain, what Master has explained, is how that can be true. And Swamiji talks about how most experiences in life are affected by what Master calls the thwarting cross currents of ego, which is that all of what we're doing is constantly being referred back to our own preferences, our own likes and dislikes, that our life itself is caught between these two armies. The material plane of existence is dual. And the ego, instinctively knowing the ephemeral nature of all that it clings to, tries to cling all the harder to all of those things. We want more money, we want more power, we want more sensual experience. imagining that we can sort of push the wave up to one side and that there'll never be a corresponding dip in it. The difficulty with all the worldly things that we quest after is it's not like they're inherently evil. It has to be understood in this way. It's that nothing in this world is fixed. The very nature of this world is that it just shifts and it shifts. Swami Kriyananda, the last book that he wrote in his life, was a really beautiful, beautiful one. Amazing that at the age of 86, the last book would be still have so much power. He never waned. He just stopped. But it is called Love Perfected, Life Divine, and it's a novel. After all this time in his life, Swami picked up a whole new art form. Well, in actual fact, he wrote 2 others, but it was not his primary form of self-expression. And he rewrote a novel written by a woman named Marie Corelli. Now, very few people know the name Marie Corelli, but 100 years ago, she was an astonishingly successful writer. But the fame that she had just came and went, just like that. And when she left her body and the form, the reality of Marie Corelli was gone, then it just dissipates into nothing. Now, by contrast, Krishna is talking about even a little practice of this religion will change you forever. And in the stanza following, which I'll read in a moment, he also talks about how you can't fail on the spiritual path. Well, it seems so obvious that you can fail on the spiritual path. You set out to be a spiritual being and you don't succeed in becoming enlightened. You give up the things of this world and you don't feel like you become liberated. You don't know really how else you could call that but failure. But this is the picture that we're trying to understand. Most of the time we live, if we're imagining a wheel, like a bicycle wheel, we live on the rim of that wheel. And even within the rim of that wheel, we have one little tiny incarnation. And so we really live on one dot on that wheel is where our life experience happens. And everything, all the incarnations that came before and all the incarnations that may come after are unknown to us. We just hold on to that one little dot. And that little dot is the identification we have with the particular body we're living in, and the ego identified, the spirit identified with that one body is the definition Yogananda gave of ego. Ego is the infinite that has persuaded itself that it's no longer infinite, but it is now dependent upon all the conditions inherent in this one physical form that I'm in. And if we think about this sensitively, we realize that ego identity with this one incarnation is really the source of all the confusion that we experience, because that's where loneliness comes from, that's where fear and insecurity come from, fear of death being the largest fear of all. We've talked about some of these in the previous weeks of this series, that we are, and rightly so, intensely vulnerable if we are identified only with this body. And that's why Krishna was talking to Arjuna at such length about what an illusion it is to think that our existence begins and ends with this one body, but identified with it, that's what happens. And that's when we get caught up in this world of duality, because as soon as the body is born, the body is inevitably going to die. And every stage along the way that the ego self becomes identified with or attached to is doomed. You marry and you have this wonderful relationship, but if you do, at the very least, death will come, and the form of that relationship will disintegrate. And often, long before death comes to both of you, perhaps death will come to one of you, or people will change. the ambitions that you have will not be fulfilled, or they will be fulfilled and that you'll experience them, the actual experience of them will not give you the fulfillment that you hope to receive from it. And it's a very important nuance to this understanding, which is, it's not that the fulfillment you get from ego-identified experiences is nothing. It's something. It's just not enough. Because what we're seeking, what our heart actually needs, is so much more. And it's an important point to remember, which Swamiji said many times very clearly. We learn from being disappointed, but we learn more from having our desires fulfilled. Because once they've been fulfilled, then we drink that particular cup to the very bottom, and you still realize that you're still hungry. Because what we're wanting is an infinite fulfillment, not merely an ego-pleasing potentiality. I had an odd experience just a few days ago, and it was just fleeting and extremely subjective, but it was very instructive for me. I was just in the middle of my day, and everything was fine. Work is going fine. Everything is just as it ought to be. And I was profoundly conscious in the middle of all of those apparently perfectly fine circumstances of an intense level that this is not enough. This is the why of the spiritual path. This is Sankhya. It's just not enough. Now, because we're trapped over here with this, in this ego identity, on the very edge of this great potential of life. Now, thinking about this bicycle wheel, this rim, the way the spiritual life is not, it's not linear. It's not like it's a straight line, and we're here, and here's the goal, and we move toward it like this. This is how we tend to think of it. I'm here. Other people are here, these people are behind me, these are in front of me, I'm this distance, and this is what's going to happen. The spiritual path is, in fact, a liberating ourselves from the periphery of our own consciousness and of consciousness itself, and a gradual moving into the center. If you think of a wheel, and if you think of all of creation as the rim, when you're in the center, you are equidistant from every aspect of it. And from that center point, all of it is accessible to you. This is where Master says, also in this section of the Gita, in the commentary, he says, spiritual life is center everywhere, circumference nowhere. Now, the image that I'm holding doesn't quite convey it perfectly, but when you stand at the center, everything is equally accessible, as I was saying, and wherever you are in creation, whatever body you're inhabiting, whatever your planet you're living on, whether you're in the astral or the causal world, if you're standing at the center point, if you're existing at the center point, the origin point of your own consciousness, then everything in creation is equally present for you. This is the point of omnipresence, center everywhere, circumference nowhere. So on the spiritual path, what we're doing when we begin to practice yoga is we're beginning to awaken to the fact that the ego identity that I thought was synonymous with myself is really just something I'm wearing superficially. And as we move from the edge toward the center, which is to begin to define ourselves as part of a greater reality, and to begin to understand more and more deeply what that greater reality is, if you're at the edge of the wheel, you really can hardly see forward or back. You have no sense of the causation that brought you to this point. You have no sense of the effect of your present actions on your future reality. But if you move in, immediately your perspective widens. And you begin to realize, oh, my own actions, my own past actions in this lifetime is a beginning, including previous incarnations as an expansion of that understanding, is affecting not only, is why I am who I am now. And then you begin to understand that what I'm doing now is going to determine what tomorrow and next year, and when you go all the way, my next incarnations will be like. So instead of just living in this dot, if your dot has moved to here, your sphere is wider, you see, until you move all the way to the center, and then your sphere becomes infinite. Even a little practice of this inward religion, moving from the periphery of our self-definition into the center of our actual reality, saves you from dire fears and colossal sufferings, because you begin to expand your awareness. And when you expand your awareness, you begin to gain the proper perspective. You become less personal, less trapped in these tiny events. You free yourself from the thwarting cross currents of ego to a certain extent, because you're able to stand back from them. And what happens to people who take up the practice of meditation or become involved even a little bit in the practices of Ananda, in the temple where I attend and preside a great deal of the time. Some people will just come on Sundays. They don't even have any personal meditation practice. Or they'll watch online events like the one that we're creating here now. If they miss a Sunday in our temple on Monday morning, they can go to our Ananda Palo Alto website and they can see whatever the message was that was delivered on Sunday. And in many cases, it has to be said honestly, this is a very little practice of this inward religion. But it begins to change consciousness, and people will tell me, as long as I come to temple on Sundays, as long as I participate in the service, receive the blessing of the Festival of Light, everything about my week is different. And the explanations that they offer are exactly what Krishna offers here. Things will happen that formerly caused me to become very upset. And now I'm able just to perceive them calmly and to respond objectively and appropriately to what needs to be done. Now, I think that's the beginning of dire fears and colossal sufferings. Isn't that what causes our dire fears and colossal sufferings? We are so trapped in the moment that our discrimination is lost. Our egoic emotional reactions are so intense that we just spin out a whole another cycle of, now that I've spoken to this person in this way, now I have the consequences of that I have to deal with, and all these cross currents of ego just become so involved. It becomes so difficult. But once we see things from a wider perspective, we may lose that perspective occasionally. Something may have sufficient karmic power to suck us in for a moment, for an hour, even for a year. But once we have understood that we are part of a greater reality, it's a truth that just simply can't be forgotten. It can be ignored for a time, but it can't be forgotten. If a person knows how to do something, knows that something is true, you can forget for a moment that it's true, but you can never go back to a former truth. And this is also what Krishna is saying. Just a little bit of awakening to what is really going on in the world of consciousness and the experience of my life. And even if we try to run away from it, it pursues us because it's become part of our makeup. And now there's another aspect to this which we have to appreciate. Let's see. There is no latent within it the opposite canceling effects of duality. Because sometimes people start getting very confused mentally. Well, if all desires have to be overcome, then isn't the desire for God itself a desire, and that we shouldn't have a desire of any kind? And the way the scriptures and the masters all answer that is that desire, which is a desire to cancel all desires, has no opposite to it. And it's because of this, you see, most of what we desire, all of what we desire that's not spiritually based, is based on what the ego itself perceives is going to give it satisfaction. And what Maya, the cosmic illusion, has persuaded us will actually bring us the fulfillment that we seek. And all of it is based, all ego-based desires and hopes for fulfillment are based on creating conditions in the ephemeral world that we want to hold as permanent. Because the one defining characteristic about the material world and the identification we have with the material body is that nothing stays the same. It's an endless cycle of change. I just had my 67th birthday. I met Swami Kriyananda when I was 22. That's now 45 years. That's a long time when you count it like that. But at the same time, it's like, what I'm trying to say is, when I met Swami, I was 22 years old. I was a young girl. I was at the beginning of this whole incarnation. Standing at that point, I never thought, I was never able to imagine what 45 years later would look like. It was just beyond me to imagine. I can remember what 45 years ago vaguely looked like, but here I am now. And that change from youth to this stage of my life, from Swami Kriyananda's middle age to now his being out of his body altogether, being in the astral world, all of that was absolutely inevitable. And the extent to which my sense of fulfillment, even on the spiritual path, was dependent on the conditions that I had when I was 22, on the presence of Swami Kriyananda and his physical body, none of that could last. It just simply, it couldn't. The first 10 years of my spiritual life that I lived at Ananda village, in the early founding days of that community, when conditions were exceedingly primitive, when we had no money, when the expectation of what Ananda would become was clear only to Swami, and it absolutely shrouded in mystery to the rest of us. It was heaven on earth, as far as I was concerned. I'd go back and relive those 10 years, probably get tired of them after a while, but I could live them for a long time, a long, long time, and still really enjoy them. But it doesn't make any difference how much I want them. Everything in this material world is doomed to change. It's just the nature of it. It's waves on the ocean, and the wave rises, and then the waves fall. So all ego fulfillment, because it's trying to take something ephemeral and draw eternal fulfillment from it, it's just simply doomed. The opposite is inherent. When I was 22, it was inherent within being 22 that I would either die or that I would become older. And Swami Kriyananda, it was inherent that he would become older, and inherent that eventually he would pass from this world. Just absolutely nothing could be done about it, because that's what it is, to incarnate in the material world. And this is, everyone thinks they're the exception. In the story of the Mahabharata, of course, from which the Gita is taken, there's the part where the 5 Pandava brothers go find themselves intensely thirsty and discover this lake. And one by one, each of the brothers goes to drink water and to bring water to his other brothers. And a voice tells them, before you drink, you have to answer my questions. And the 4 younger brothers in sequence all drink without first answering the questions, and they all die. And then the eldest, the wisest, the son of Dharma himself comes, and he stops and he answers the questions. And it turns out he's being quizzed by his own father, the king of Dharma. And at the end, because Yudhishthira is so pleasing to his father, all four of the brothers are brought back to life again, because his father is also the god of death, Yama. But the last question that's asked of Yudhishthira is, what is the single most astonishing fact about human life? And he answers, he said, that's an obvious answer, is that death is all around him, and that everyone dies, and every individual thinks it's not going to happen to him. Now, it's not just physical death itself, but it's the death of everything. I love when my children are small. I love this job that I have. I'm so pleased with the way my body looks. I'm so happy with the money that I've got. I'm so pleased that people recognize me and know who I am, and that my sense of self-worth and satisfaction comes from this. But we think it's not going to happen to us, that people are not going to turn on you, that economic conditions, that those children won't grow up or die young, whatever it might be. But with spiritual life, what we're doing is we're detaching ourselves from the ever-changing, and we're moving into the unchanging. And in the unchanging, there is no opposite. I mean, that is the definition of the unchanging, the eternal, unchanging, ever new, but nonetheless unchanging. That's a paradox that will have to be resolved within us. I'll explain more in a few moments. But unchanging because there's no opposite to it. It is the single source. The picture that is a very valid image to understand the nature of this universe is that spirit itself is solitary, silent, and still, unmoving. And then the vibration of Om begins. And the vibration moves. And so there's only one, but it begins to move. And when it begins to move, you lose track of the fact that it's only one. Swamiji uses the example of the propeller of an airplane or the blade of a fan. When the electricity is running through it and that blade is spinning, it looks like a solid. And it's only when it stops that you see that there's just one propeller. It's not really a circle at all. It's one thing moving very quickly. So we look at this world and we see it very differently because the vibrations are happening so fast. But when we move closer and closer to the origin point of stillness, which we can do in our own consciousness, you see, that's why we go inside for meditation. And it's not really like we're going inside in the physical body, but what we're doing is we're withdrawing from our outward focus. I like the edge of the wheel. We're moving in from the edge to the origin point. And the physical world that we live in and our senses and all that we're manifesting and all that we're relating to and all that we're accumulating is the very periphery of our existence. And in fact, it's vicarious, is how Swami put it earlier, and I quoted that. It's a vicarious experience. It's not direct. We experience it through the senses. Our brain reads it in a certain way, and then we have the experience. What's so fascinating, you see, is that it's not inherent in what we're experiencing. It's how the brain reads that reality. Yesterday I was in the car with a friend, and here in California where I live, a lot of people have put into their cars these extremely powerful, I hesitate to use the word music systems, I'll call them sound systems, that's what they are, and very popular in this country and culture at this time is this horrible sound that people call music, but it's not music. It's just this harsh, beating rhythm, very ego-affirming, harsh, beating sound. And they get these sound systems that have this very low vibration, low in consciousness too, just whoom, 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 like that. And sometimes you stop, which we were stopped yesterday in an intersection. The car right next to us was playing that, and it was just coming right through the walls of their car into our car, and this thumping vibration was there. And we were saying to each other, I mean, how can that person trapped in that car with that vibration going through them, how could they do that to themselves on purpose? And even for us, sitting next to them, it was so unpleasant for the duration of the red light until we could drive away. But you see, it's just all how the brain interprets it. The person next to us had spent a lot of money and gone to a lot of trouble to be able to have that experience inside their car, and we felt like we were being tortured, just being trapped next to them for just a few seconds, really, because it's the brain that interprets it, and the brain is guided by our level of consciousness, our self-definition of what we consider, our egoic definition of what we consider pleasurable and not. By contrast, Swamiji makes a point of this, of all the possibilities in the universe, of all the professions, of all the achievements, a person who reaches the pinnacle of their profession may find joy in doing it, but no one except the saints says this is the answer for everyone. And every self-realized master, every highly advanced spiritual person says quite simply, God is for everyone. Because all that we're seeking is outside of our true reality, and once we come into our true reality, we immediately know it. This is what I was really looking for. Even in that horrible, throbbing sound, what they're looking for will, even for those souls, well, I should say, especially for those souls, for everyone, will eventually be found in the spirit. And once you are in the unchanging reality, there is no opposite to it. And so even a little practice, a little movement away from the definition of the waves as reality to the one still center of oneself as reality releases you from all of the suffering that's inherent in the up and downs to the exact extent that you yourself have transcended them. Swami Kriyananda made a statement once in a satsang that was very profound. He said, because this world that we live in, the material world that we perceive through the senses and that the ego identifies with, because that world is so complex, we naturally project upon the creator of that complexity an even greater complexity. And he said, but in fact, it's the external reality that's complicated. The inner world is simple. And we talked about this earlier. The Pandavas were 5, and Duryodhana and his brothers were hundreds, or 100. There were 100 of Duryodhana and his brothers, or 101, and there were 5 of the Pandavas. Because the closer you get to the origin of your own self and the origin of all creation, you see that the vibrations become smaller and smaller until they cease entirely and everything reduces to one. And that simple fact is also very important to keep in mind, because what we do is we relax into this simplicity, and everything, instead of seeing all the different details of all the rising and falling waves, we just see the one flow of the ocean, the one vibration of spirit, the one reality of God behind it all. And this too inherently releases us from dire fears and colossal sufferings, because in everything that's happening around us, all we see is the loving hand of God. And this is how Krishna described to Arjuna, when you slay your enemies and see them fall, that's what you think is happening. But Krishna realizes that the spirit which animated that body was never born and can never die. So what he sees is the unchanging. Arjuna sees the battle, the struggle, the life, the death, and all Krishna sees is the one stream of life, dancing in this way, dancing in that way, dancing in this way. but just that one stream. You see what freedom really is the only word, what extraordinary freedom is involved there? Now, Swamiji, Master, also wanted us really to understand that the practice of yoga is not the same as the practice of religion. Here, Swami translates this, even a little practice of this religion. Swami retranslated or re-articulated the verses of the Gita. When we quote this same phrase every week in the Festival of Light, which I referred to earlier, which is a ritual that we offer through the Ananda temples, this same line is quoted, but Swamiji, to make it perfectly clear, said, even a little practice of this inward religion. Because the problem is, we have with this word religion and what religion has become. I recently had a exchange, a rather unfortunate exchange is the only word I can use, with an acquaintance through social media, through the internet. It's an Indian gentleman, a Hindu, and he was asking me, very fair question, about the fact that I call myself a Swami, but I'm not dressed in orange, that I'm dressed in blue. And at the end of Swami Kriyananda's life, after a lifetime of wearing the ochre robe, he changed into a blue robe, and we began to call ourselves Nayaswamis. Naya means new, and we were part of the Nayaswami order. So this gentleman rightly asked me, what is that all about? It's a question I'm not going to answer here completely. I'll give you the same answer I gave him. Swami Kriyananda felt inspired by God to create a Nayaswami order, that he felt that the ancient Swami order needed certain reforms. And he explains that at great length in a book he called A New Renunciate Order for a New Age. And if you go onto the internet, you'll be able to find that. In fact, you'll be able to find the whole book. And he has very cogent and thoughtful reasons for why he's making those changes. So I suggested to my internet friend that he read that book and contemplate all the things that Swamiji said. But instead he wrote back to me and said, in Hinduism, this is what we do. And he asserted the principles of the Swami order as it presently exists. I wrote back and said Swami Kriyananda is a reformer, and reformers are all criticized until history embraces what they reformed. We don't remember whether Adi Shankaracharya was vilified for reorganizing the Swami order at that time, but human nature being what it was, I would be willing to bet that he was. And it's only because that vilification has now been lost and only the adulation remains that we consider that this is what Hinduism does now. But I wrote back to him and said, well, Swami has very cogent reasons for what he did. You have to read it. Because you see, there's a big difference between the revelations of a master and what the subsequent followers do with that. And the religion that Krishna is proposing here, even though it may be somewhat identified with Hinduism, is not Hinduism, it's not Christianity, it's Sanatana Dharma in its true meaning, which is the inherent truth, that is the revelation that all masters have. It's not any of the outward rituals, because the outward rituals will not free you from dire fears and colossal sufferings. Because what they will free you from is, well, many things perhaps, but not the dire fear, not the colossal suffering. It's only the inward revelation, and all the rituals and all the outward behaviors are designed only to spark that inner realization. And just as, well, going back to the Nayaswami order, the reason Swamiji felt it needed to be reformed is, among other things, that so many of the very principles that Adi Shankaracharya laid down are not honored anymore. Swamis can't own anything, Swamis can't touch money, Swamis can't stay more than 3 days in any one place. Swami Kriyananda says if you tried to be that kind of Swami in America, you'd be arrested for vagrancy. And they're honored in the breach in much of India as well. And so it's just time to renew this, because the outer form is no longer creating the same inner change. Because I've gone this far, I might as well finish it. Swamiji's shifting of the color is interesting in itself. Now, we're shifting from Kali Yuga into Dwapara Yuga. So part of the reason why this is a time for a reform, and whether the Nayaswami order gradually replaces the existing Swami order or becomes merely an alternative and parallel reality, is in God's hands. We're not here for the fame. We're just doing what feels right, and what Swamiji guided us to do. Is that in Kali Yuga, where the form of things was the most important reality, the orange color, you were trying to burn up everything that was holding you back. You were looking at your attachments and you were dissolving them in the fire, and that's what the orange represents. But the purpose of doing that was that it was the ego itself, above all, that you were trying to dissolve. Your physical attachments, the reason that you wanted to repudiate them was because they held you to that ego attachment. But it was, in a sense, an indirect way of trying to dissolve your ego, was dissolve those things that your ego is attached to, and perhaps that will give you the freedom eventually to be free of the ego itself. So the focus was on the fire. Swamiji feels that in Dwapara Yuga, where we can think more in terms of energy, and where matter itself has now been revealed to be energy, that we can approach it more directly. And blue is the color of Christ consciousness. That's why Krishna is always portrayed as blue, that the infinite consciousness is represented by this blue color. We go into the spiritual eye, into the field of blue, and then through the blue field penetrate through the white star into the infinite. So instead of affirming what we're leaving behind, we're affirming where we are going, and dissolving the ego by merging into infinite consciousness, and all the other attachments will fall away automatically. And in this day and age, in which spirituality is, because it's a higher age, spirituality is more integrated into society, it's possible to live that way, which is why also that Nayaswamis do not necessarily have to repudiate their marriage, that a couple can become Nayaswamis together. The same restrictions on your individual life that apply to any true renunciate apply even though one retains that relationship. But the relationship just becomes part of the whole fabric of the life you're living, and is seen also as a relationship in God, and not the ego-affirming relationship that marriage usually is. This is a new renunciate order for a new age. In other words, the concentration is on inner consciousness. And religion itself, and Paramhansa Yogananda predicted this, he made the declaration, self-realization has come to unite all religions. Some followers of Yogananda have interpreted that very bold statement to mean that the actual path of being a disciple of Yogananda, Yogananda as the guru, this particular lineage is the big mega lineage for the whole age to come. That's not at all what Master meant. He meant the principle of self-realization is, and as he explained it elsewhere, self-realization is the unifying reality, he said, behind all true religions. And that's why he taught from both the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita, representing East and West, the two fundamental realities that are perceived by many of their followers as inherently opposite. Master wanted to show that self-realization is the unifying principle behind them. Because whatever is said in dogma and ritual practice, the only purpose of that is to take you into inner consciousness. It's not an end in itself. And again, that's why this religion, which is the religion of yoga, has no opposite, because it takes you into inner consciousness, whereas so much of religion is not really anymore about inward change. It's about going to heaven. And heaven itself, as Swami says, is just a place that's extremely pleasing to the ego. And he said, for the true devotee, an ego-pleasing heaven where you're trapped in a physical body, he said, even if that body is young and vibrant for all of eternity, Swami said, is a definition of hell, not heaven. What we want to be freed from is all limitation. It was interesting. It has been interesting for me to reflect on what was motivating me as a young person prior to the time that I discovered the principles of self-realization. Because, of course, I grew up in the United States, and therefore, and I grew up in the United States, I was born in 1947, and even though Yogananda's book was published in 1946, it did not enter my world until, seriously enter my world until I met Swami Kriyananda when I was 22. And we were not Christian, we were Jewish, and the Jewish religion, although it's a true religion and the principles of self-realization are within the revelation that is the basis of that religion as it is practiced, Sanatana Dharma is fairly distant from it. I just knew nothing. I didn't have any idea about moksha. I didn't have any idea about meditation, none of those things, absolutely none. But when I discovered these teachings, which I started learning when I was 18, I just immediately understood and recognized it. And in retrospect, I think the single motivating pressure within me was that I felt so confined. And I didn't have any idea what was confining me. It was a samskar that was my state of consciousness, but because of my culture and my physical age, I had no way to conceptualize that. Swami Kriyananda made a very interesting statement, which I love contemplating when I see little children, that the full intelligence and the full consciousness is present really from conception and certainly from birth. It's not like that child's spiritual development, wherever he was in the last incarnation, which is one of the stanzas that's coming up really soon. You can't fail on the spiritual path, because when you die, you just begin your next incarnation with the divine understanding, with the state of consciousness that you achieved in your last. But an infant and a small child lacks language and lacks context. So even though their intelligence and their consciousness is there, they can't share it with us in a way that can be externally understood. Of course, many parents and children with each other, they have a strong intuitive understanding, but it's not conceptual. So I realized, looking back on my life, that the intuition was always there. There is a way out of here. I'm amused to remember a friend of mine, her son, when he was 5, he handed his mother a sealed envelope, which was a letter to God that he had written, and he wanted his mother to mail it, send it to God for him. He was able to write it, but he didn't really quite know the delivery system, and he thought his mother might know the delivery system. So this mother holds this envelope for a while, and she assured her child she would deliver it. She was herself a meditating devotee, so she actually felt she could at least deliver it vibrationally. And she thinks for a minute about respecting his privacy, but simply couldn't stand not to open the letter. So she opened it up, and it's from her son, and it says, "Dear God, get me out of here." And I mean, he had a wonderful family. His parents really loved him. He was privileged and comfortable. It wasn't that he was suffering in that sense. But there was that awareness. Here I am, trapped in this child's body, I want to be myself. And so looking back on my own spiritual journey, that the years before I had words for it, I needed self-realization. I knew there was a pathway to freedom, and I was determined to find it. And one of the things that captured me literally instantaneously the first time I was in the presence of Swami Kriyananda was the fact that I could feel his freedom. See, all of these things are intuitive. I could feel his freedom. I could feel that this man moved through the same world that I was moving through, but his experience of it was completely different than mine. And his experience of it was exactly the experience that I had been, well, by that point, desperately seeking. And the intuitive articulation inside of me, the moment I laid eyes on Swami Kriyananda, was, he has what I want. And I couldn't at that time say what it was. It only dawned on me slowly. But I felt it instantly. And I instantly knew it was also mine, because we had moved from this peripheral egoic identification. Kriyananda was no longer defined as Kriyananda. He himself put it this way, not very long afterwards. I have never identified with Swami Kriyananda, is how he put it. I have always considered Swami Kriyananda to be an event for which I am responsible. I've loved that way of saying it, because that explains how you live at the center, but from the center your consciousness extends out as far as it has to extend out. It extends all the way out to the event of Swami Kriyananda, which he carried out in a most responsible manner, but he never allowed it to define him. This is quite peripheral to the central discussion, but it comes to mind as we're talking about it here. Swami Kriyananda was a world citizen. He was raised by American parents with an American passport, but in Europe, and he spoke 4 languages by the time he was 10. He was English, was his native tongue, and he spoke it with his parents. He was born in Romania, so he spoke Romanian with the people who worked in the house and everyone on the street. The nurse who took care of them, the children, was from Germany, so they learned to speak German with their nurse, and when he was 9, he was sent to school in Switzerland and learned to speak French. So even from the beginning, he was in multi-cultures with many different people speaking many different languages. And then he eventually learned 8 languages and was at home wherever he was in the world, really. So that's a part of this. But Swamiji told us once that he had a dream. And the way he described it, I think it was a superconscious dream, which is to say that it wasn't just a projection of his own mind, but I believe it really happened. And in the dream, there was a delegation from another planet that was contacting him, and it was a planet, they said, in which they really needed more serious spiritual direction than they were receiving, and they really wanted Swami Kriyananda to come with them and to be the spiritual leader of their planet. And Swamiji said he was very touched by the sincerity of this delegation and the fact that they'd gone to all the trouble to find him, to try to get him to go. And he was inclined to go with them, because he has a very compassionate heart. He was inclined to go with them and serve them in the way they were asking. He said, but just before he agreed, he realized, a whole new culture, a whole new language. He said, I'll have to start over and accustom myself to all of that before I'll be able to do any good work at all. So he had to disappoint them and say that he wasn't able to come. I've always wondered, would Swamiji have existed simultaneously then on 2 planets? Or would he have died to this planet to have gone with him? Swamiji never explained or never felt the necessity to explain. But the degree of freedom in time and space that is possible to us when we no longer so deeply identify with the little ego and the little body we're in is really truly extraordinary to contemplate. master talked about the fact that when he would chant Om, he said his vibrations were simultaneously present around the whole planet whenever he would chant Om. And he tells stories in Autobiography of a Yogi of just going into the reality of other bodies and other people. Lahiri Mahashaya talks about suddenly feeling that he's drowning, and then the next day it's discovered that a boat has sunk off the coast of Japan, and it was sinking right at the moment when Lahiri Mahashaya in his living room in Varanasi was feeling that reality. Yogananda, at the end of his life, Swami Kriyananda talks about him, Yogananda, walking around the outside garden of the retreat house where he was living and holding on to Swami Kriyananda's arm while they walked. And then he would stumble sometimes. And he said, Yogananda ji said, I'm in so many bodies, sometimes I forget which one I'm supposed to keep moving. In other words, he forgets which event he's actually responsible for and stops participating in the event of keeping that particular body alive. He said, I have to ask others whether or not I have eaten. Because he's so little in his own body, he doesn't even know if it's being fed. Isn't that just so fabulous to contemplate? It's a really fruitful and wonderful meditation, even if that is not our habitual state of consciousness. When we're meditating, to try to go so deeply inside ourselves as to really imagine what would it be like to just leave this entire reality behind. Swami Kriyananda has often recommended as a serious spiritual practice, every evening before you go to sleep, he said, as he puts it, build a mental bonfire. And into that bonfire, just throw everything that you're attached to. Just, I've enjoyed this. I've been grateful to God for this experience that you've given me. And now I just put it all into this bonfire. I liberate myself from all these identifications. The traditional Indian system of the 4 stages of life, and at the end of life, just leaving everything behind and going off into the woods. In the Mahabharata itself, well, at the end, the Pandavas also just leave the kingdom behind and leave it in the hands of the grandson. But before that, their own beloved parents, they just go off into the woods. I'm finished. I'm going to prepare now for the time when I have to let this go completely by now turning my back on it. Now I'm just going to walk away and no longer identify with that event. And in America, sometimes people hold so tightly to the things of this world until the very last moment. The room in which they die is filled with pictures of the family. But you see, it's so very interesting how often a beloved elder will wait until there's no one else in the room before they'll leave their body. Because it's time to let go completely of that physical identification, and it's more difficult to do if someone is there holding you. When my friend Paula died, and for those of you who've seen the movie Finding Happiness, I talk in the movie about her death. I didn't say everything, of course, because it's a tiny segment there and everything wasn't appropriate. But when she was actually dying, in the days leading up to her death, when she was in the hospital and she knew that it was the end of her life, she had a husband, and she loved him very much, and he was with her through all of those days. He was, and he often sat on the edge of the bed, and he would hold her hand or put his arm around her. He was often physically close to her. But at the very end, when she, in the middle of the night, as I describe in that movie, when she consciously sat up and knew that she was going to leave her body, which she did consciously at that point, her husband sat down next to her and he started to put his arm around her to comfort her. And she turned to him kindly, but so impersonally. She said, "Don't touch me. I can still feel it. Meaning, don't distract me from where I'm going. Don't hold on to this body. Don't remind me of who I've been. I'm still vulnerable to that. I'm still conscious enough of my body that I can feel you touching me, so don't touch me. And he was, for a moment, quite startled. But then out of loyalty to what he really loved in her, which was her divine spirit, he pulled back and let her leave. Now, even a little practice of this inward religion will save us from dire fears, the fear of death being prime among them, and colossal sufferings. And isn't that a result that we're all seeking? God bless you.